Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. Thank you for joining today's webinar on Irish Unity, brought to you by the Irish Canada Business Council and the Ireland Canada Chamber of Commerce in Montreal. My name is Geraldine Flynn. I'm the Executive Director at Ireland Canada Business Council. Just before we introduce the speakers, I just want to cover a few housekeeping rules before we start. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we can send around a link to the recording after the session is over. We will have time afterwards for a Q&A session, so please feel free to use the Q&A chat box at the bottom end of your screen. If you have any questions throughout the session, just type it in there and we will hold it for the discussion point at the end. So at this time, I'm going to pass you over to Paul Dunn, who's president of the Irish Canada Chamber of Commerce in Montreal. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Geraldine, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, as Geraldine says. My name is Paul Dunn. I'm president of the Ireland Canada Chamber of Commerce in Montreal, and I'm a director of the Ireland Canada Business Council. The Ireland Canada Chamber of Commerce is a voluntary organization based in Montreal whose mission is to promote commercial liaisons between Canada and Ireland. And along with our counterparts in Ottawa, Toronto, Calgary and Vancouver, we have created a new all-Canada coalition called the Ireland Canada Business Council. If you're not already a member of one of those local chambers, or trade associations, we will be providing the links to their websites at the end of the Q&A session. So I'd encourage you to go there, find out a little bit more about them and participate if you can. It's a great and worthy cause. Thank you for having turned up in, I hope, such great numbers. We had a lot of registrations. Very happy about that. This is very exciting. It's our first joint event of the Ireland Canada Chamber of Commerce and the Ireland Canada Business Council, and a warm welcome to Minister Neale Richmond, our speaker for today's presentation on Irish Unity. Now, without further ado, let me hand over to James Fitzpatrick, Communications Director of the Ireland Canada Chamber of Commerce in Montreal, who will introduce our esteemed guest. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. My name is James Fitzgerald. Thanks, Paul, for getting my name wrong. Well done.
Oh, gee, I did it again.
I'm originally from Dublin, and I work for the World Anti-Doping Agency in Montreal. I'm also a director of the Ireland Canada Chamber of Commerce. So it's with great pleasure that I can welcome to this group Neale Richmond, TD. In January of this year, Deputy Richmond was appointed as Minister of State at the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, and also at the Department of Social Protection. Much of his work is with businesses, workers, their representative bodies and the state agencies to ensure that the economic recovery and growth extends to all parts of Ireland. He works closely with the small and medium enterprise sector, including retail, on building resilience and on the transition to the green and digital economies. Prior to his role as Minister of State, he was elected as a TD for Dublin Rathdown in the 2020 general election. And prior to that, he was a senator in Shannon on the Labour panel, where he was also Fine Gael spokesperson on European affairs and chair of the Shannon Special Select Committee on Brexit. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and a master's in politics from University College Dublin. Outside of politics, I know he's very interested in sport, particularly rugby. I think he even still plays for Old Wesley, and occasionally will prop up the scrum for the Irish parliamentary team as well. So maybe when he gets his presentation out of the way, we can ask him what he thinks, or how he thinks Ireland are going to get on in the next couple of weeks as they go for the Grand Slam of the Six Nations. But for now, I'd like to welcome Neale Richmond. Thank you very much, Minister Richmond, for joining us. We're very interested to hear what you have to say on this subject of Irish unity. Over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you, Paul, for that welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here, albeit virtually with you. Although, as I was saying prior to coming online, I hope very much to be heading up a trade delegation on behalf of the government in a couple of months' time to Canada. And as part of that, there's many old friends, some of whom I recognise are on the call here in Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa, as well as many other Canadian cities that I promised to pay a visit to and perhaps bring a couple of packs of vacuum black pudding over. I'm very grateful, James, that you mentioned, of course, my rugby prowess. Not only because you, in your former life back here in Ireland, you gave me many a dig out by offering to referee, and of course our relationship goes back to the 90s when we played cricket together, of all things, for the YMCA. And you can correct me later, but I think your couple of caps for Ireland actually came against Canada in a tour, not today or yesterday, but once upon a time. So I know you had your background blurred there, but for those who had seen the background without blurring, there would have been a considerable amount of cricket and rugby memorabilia, no doubt, due to your previous careers, your current work, and of course your noted performances as a referee at a very, very high level here in Ireland. And I hope you're still keeping a hand in Quebec. This evening for me, or this afternoon or this morning's presentation, will focus on an issue that's particularly dear to my heart, but has become increasingly relevant over the last couple of multitude of years here on our islands. I will stress from the outset that I speak in a personal capacity. My views are closely held. They don't necessarily align with the views of my political party. They don't necessarily align with the views of the Irish government, but I hope they will, and I hope they will very soon. And I think we are entering into an extremely interesting period in our shared home, Ireland's future. And I think why I was so keen to speak to this audience about this topic is I think it's something that needs to be discussed, not just around the breakfast tables in Dublin and Belfast, Cork and Derry, but increasingly amongst our diaspora community, amongst those who left in the last couple of years for whatever reason, or indeed maybe whose parents or grandparents or great-great-grandparents moved abroad many years ago and still hold such dear concern for the future of Ireland and what may happen going forward. To be honest, the issue of Irish unity for me, I think, has become increasingly more likely that we'll be potentially voting on reunification in the next decade. And the reason for that, and there's one reason alone in my mind, it is Brexit. Brexit has changed everything. And I dedicated 6 or 7 years of my life as a councillor, senator, and indeed as a TD to Brexit, be it as chair of the committee, as James said, or as a regular commentator on British and international television, warning just how mad the entire concept of Brexit was, and genuinely stressing a concern for the impact a bad Brexit could have on the island of Ireland and on the very precious Good Friday Agreement that will celebrate its 25th anniversary next month. And the impact of Brexit, it's been no surprise, it's been terrible. The British economy is in an extremely difficult position, particularly when it's compared to European counterparts, when it's compared to other G7 countries. And I take no pleasure in that. I have a great affection for the United Kingdom. The vast majority of my friends and relations live there. I support Arsenal, of course, who are top of the league. And as I mentioned, I played cricket for many a year with James, so I'm no Anglophobe, but Brexit has been a bad decision. And it's been a decision taken with very serious impacts that were never thought through. Because the problem with Brexit is it was a concept. No one ever laid out the details of what Brexit looked like. And that provides a very salutary lesson for those of us in Ireland and those of us who advocate for Irish unity. And I'll touch on that a little bit later on. But I think why the impact of Brexit has really brought the potential of unification or reunification of our island a lot closer is quite clear. First and foremost, the easiest way for the people of Northern Ireland to regain their European citizenship or their membership within the European Union isn't for the UK to rejoin the EU, but in fact for Northern Ireland and Ireland, the Republic, to reunify. One of the first decisions and one of the first achievements of Enda Kenny as Taoiseach post the Brexit referendum in 2016 was to get the unanimous agreement of the European Council that in the case of Irish unity being voted on by the people of North and South, that automatically a reunited Ireland would be a full member of the European Union, using the precedent of the reunification in Germany achieved in the 90s under an Irish presidency of the Council of the European Union. So I think that's something that is extremely important when you look at Northern Ireland being a place where the majority didn't vote for Brexit and where there's an increasing majority that do not identify as unionist, The nationalist majority or minority has kind of stayed the same, but there is a massive growing middle or other, both in terms of census returns and in terms of electoral results, with the rise of the Alliance Party at every level. The instability in Northern Ireland, the very negative impact of Brexit is causing people, many of whom I know, and many of whom, indeed, a number of whom are my relations and family friends, for the first time in their life, to actually think seriously about, well, what impact of unification, what would it really have on me? Many of these people are ones who came from a unionist background, a loyalist background, an agnostic background, and for the first time, they're starting to wonder, well, is our future better within the United Kingdom or as part of the United Ireland? I fundamentally feel that it is. It would be better, but we need to lay out the reasons why and the methods, by the way, which we could achieve unity. I suppose when you look at the real impact of Brexit and the instability it's causing, it's forcing people to ask questions and confront uncomfortable norms a lot more easily than they would have before. Any potential vote on unification, of course, would be one based on consent as per the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. The real difficulty is that any move to call for a border poll or any decision to hold a referendum, it isn't in the gift of any Irish politician. It's in the gift of the British Secretary of State from Northern Ireland, and he or she must deem that the conditions have been met to justify calling a referendum. Now, the current holder of that office, Chris Heaton-Harris, has said he doesn't believe the conditions have been met based either in the results of the Assembly election or indeed the Westminster election, where unionists certainly were the largest bloc. But what we haven't seen from him is a clear identification of what are the reasons and what threshold needs to be reached electorally, because governing by opinion poll isn't an option here. There has to be a democratic and electoral mandate. What I do take solace for is that the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, John Kyle from the Labour Party, has said quite clearly in response to a challenge from Leo Varadkar when he was Taoiseach, that if he was to become Secretary of State after the next general election, that he will lay out in advance what he feels the tests or terms necessary are to hold any border poll. And that vote would, I fundamentally believe, have to take place in both jurisdictions in Northern Ireland and indeed the Republic. But in order to get there, we need a plan, and we need a vision. We need a plan on what a referendum would look like and how it would be held, and a vision of what a new Ireland would look like, because it will and it must be a new Ireland. That's the medium term, but first it's important to address the short term. The short term, the matter of fact, it's quite clear that Northern Ireland is far from stable. We have a situation that the impact of Brexit is continuing to lead to a collapsed executive and a failure to reconvene the Assembly. And we must see in the next coming weeks if the Windsor framework of the implementation of the Northern Irish Protocol can lead to a return to Stormont. I fundamentally believe that the Windsor framework will be supported massively in the House of Commons, not just by the governing Conservative Party, but by the opposition Labour Party, the SNP, most Northern Irish MPs that take their seats. But the big question is whether the DUP will back it, or whether they will back it in a manner that will see the Assembly reconvened. And it's crucially important for everyone on this island, indeed across these islands, that we see the Assembly reconvene. The people of Northern Ireland need a functioning, devolved government now. They need one in order to access post-COVID supports from the government in London, as well as the new cost of living measures, because I'm sure it's no different in Canada. The cost of living, the impacts of the cost of living crisis are being acutely felt across this island, but more so perhaps in Northern Ireland, where we see a considerable amount of industrial action and strikes, be they at hospitals or in schools or in various other public or private enterprises. The Northern Irish Protocol does offer Northern Ireland a huge opportunity to thrive economically in terms of having full access to both the European single market and the Great British market, but it needs to, and that is absolutely in everybody's interest, but that needs to be achieved sooner rather than later. We need that because those of us who aspire to Irish unity, we need Northern Ireland to work now, regardless if we're going to achieve that unity. Achieving unity in a time of chaos or achieving unity in a time of disconnect is not a pathway for anything that is in any way sustainable or indeed prosperous. But I think if we were in a position to get Northern Ireland back on an even keel, then we can have a constructive, open and realistic debate about the prospects of why Northern Ireland should join with the Republic in a reunified state. And I think if we look at the broader challenge that throws down to those of us in the Republic who aspire for a united Ireland, we need to break down the very physical and metaphorical barriers that exist between North and South. How many people from Clare will visit Belfast for a shopping excursion? How many people from my home in Dublin would think of going to the Northampton coast for a long weekend? How many people from Roscommon would think of going to study in Queens? How many businesses are really engaging in North-South trade? So much more can and needs to be achieved if we are to be serious not only about unification, or indeed so serious about the status quo and making our small island on the edge of Europe work as best possible. Fundamentally, I believe that the best option is reunification and bringing together the best aspects of Ireland, North and South. And there are very many differences within the island, but there is an increasing amount of commonalities. Indeed, far more unites us than indeed divides us. Ireland, North and South, is also becoming increasingly a more cosmopolitan place where far more people wouldn't in Northern Ireland describe themselves as unionist or nationalist, and far more people arriving in this country weren't born here, or indeed whose parents were born in another country, are starting to really want to tear down long-held divisions that have no place in a modern society. But to go back to the point, if we are to achieve unity, we need a plan and we need a vision. In terms of a plan, we need to lay out exactly what a border poll looks like. And this is the key lesson of Brexit. We can't simply have a referendum without defining what the outcome means. So if people voted for the status quo, we know what partition means, and we know what the stance of Northern Ireland is within the United Kingdom, or indeed more widely, not within the European Union. But what does unity mean? And how do we achieve it? We need to approach that referendum knowing that a united Ireland equals X or indeed Y or Z, that people aren't just voting for a concept, an aspiration, a dream, or indeed possibly a nightmare, because that's what we have with Brexit. There was no blueprint as to what a Brexit Britain looked like. Indeed, we have a particularly hard Brexit at the moment, despite the fact that Leave only won that referendum by 52 points to 48. So I think we need to plan out exactly how we come to a border poll. It's my opinion, and again, I stress this is my personal opinion, and lots of people will take issue with it, indeed, including within my own political party, or indeed I'm slightly at odds with my own Taoiseach and party leader in this. I feel that, yes, when a border poll is deemed necessary from the Secretary of State in Northern Ireland, that we need to move into a clear timeline of what happens next. Deeming a border poll necessary doesn't mean we plan a referendum for 6 weeks' time. No, we need to have genuine consultation and engagement. And I believe that begins on a parliamentary level. Firstly, with the Joint Oireachtas Committee on the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. Secondly, with the Executive Committee of the Northern Irish Assembly. And thirdly, with the Northern Irish Affairs Committee of the House of Commons. Those three committees each need to go into their own groupings and then work together to prevent what they believe is a vision. I then believe that should be put to an all-island citizens' assembly, 100 random people taken from every demographic from all parts of the island. I don't believe in a citizens' assembly right now, despite many calls, many valid calls, because I have the distinct fear that this will be an echo chamber, and indeed we'll be talking about something that mightn't be happening for quite some time in a vacuum. Rather, we need to, when we know a border poll is merited, that's when we bring in all views, north, south. Everyone has to get engaged in it. If you hold a citizens' assembly now, far too many people simply will opt out. But if we have it after we know a referendum has to come, well then that's bound to provide a much clearer outlook. Obviously, we would need an electoral commission put together, I would say, with a returning officer from overseas, perhaps someone from Canada, looking at the model of the great work that General John de Chastelin did in terms of decommissioning to implement and run this referendum. We're able to present to the people, north and south, on the same day a clear vision. Vote for unity and this will happen. Vote against unity and you'll stay the same. I think that is the clearest way to make sure that we approach this in a way that is rational, that is reasonable, that has full democratic buy-in, north and south. And then we need a vision. And this is the real challenge for politicians like myself, for political parties like my own, particularly my own, who calls themselves Fine Gael, the United Ireland Party, or indeed any party on this island. And again, I am not going to lurch in any sort of party political broadcasts or criticism or anything like that. And I would have laid out in a paper I presented at the University of Cambridge about 18 months ago, a paper called Towards a New Ireland, what I believe should be the outlines of a new Ireland, because it has to be a new Ireland. It can't simply be an extension of the Republic into Northern Ireland, because the whole point for me of unity is not reclaiming some historical aspiration, but creating a better state, a new state that serves all the people of this island better, regardless of their religious or ethnic background or what they identify as politically. And I think if you look at what Northern Ireland does well and what the Republic does well, if you pool them together, we're an island of just over 7 million people. We're a very small space. The more we pool our resources, the more we work towards a unified goal, the more I think we can achieve. Having Invest NI competing with the IDA, having Board Fáilte and the Northern Irish Tourist Board competing, it's not in our interests. We need to see more Tourism Ireland, like more examples like that of Tourism Ireland. We need to see more buy-in fundamentally from the whole island, because I think that's how we attract better business, how we grow the economy north and south. The economy in the Republic, of course, is motoring along extremely well post-pandemic. It's the fastest growing economy in the European Union. We've effective full employment. We still have massive societal challenges in terms of the provision of housing and the reformation of our healthcare system. We look at Northern Ireland and we look at their free healthcare at the point of access on demand, and we say, well, how can we do it? We look at our education system. What's better, the Leaving Certificate or the A levels? What's the future of transfer tests? How do we achieve fully integrated education? Do we still need to retain the sectarian divisions when it comes to education, north and south, that are in place at the moment? And what are the status of fully mixed schools? Or are we still going to segregate schools by sex? I think we need to lay out a whole plan of what clearly a new Ireland would look like. What are the best bits from both jurisdictions, and indeed from other jurisdictions that can present a new Ireland? A lot of people, when they get into discussion, they focus on, oh, what about the national anthem? What about the flag? What about symbols? I do not for an instant fail to recognise that they are extremely important, but I fundamentally believe they should be the last things that are discussed in this conversation, not the first. The first needs to be our society, our economy. What does our education system look like? What about our policing models, north and south? How do we combine our efforts best to achieve a far more equal and fairer society? How do we improve the lot of those from disadvantaged community, those who face barriers perhaps due to gender or disability or ethnic background? How do we address those in a new Ireland? What do we consider when we look at our constitutional makeup? How can we make our politics work better? What electoral system we use? All these meaty issues that people need to dig into. And to paraphrase John Hume, ultimately, people cannot eat a flag. They need to have the ability to raise their families and live their life in a safe, prosperous state that looks after all the citizens equally and provides that equality of opportunity that so many of us aspire to today in our various jurisdictions, but fundamentally believe that a unified Ireland can achieve that within the European Union much better. We also need to decide our international relations. How do we work far more closely with the United Kingdom? How do we retain that sense of Britishness for what would have been unionist citizens? How do we make sure that everyone is equal, whether they are an Irish passport, a British passport, or they're a legal resident, or they're an EU resident from a different member state? These are big questions and there's no simple answers, but I think it is fundamental that when we talk about unity, that we say, well, this is what we have to aim towards. It can't just be an invisible concept. This has to be a medium and long-term project that will ultimately be of benefit to everyone on this island, but also our diaspora. What about those people who may want to return to this new Ireland? How can they play their part? How do we open up our electoral franchise to those Irish citizens who live abroad? And what part will they play? Do we need a unicameral parliamentary assembly, or do we need a bicameral one like we have at the moment in the Republic? Where will we have seats for our diaspora like they do in Italy and France? Who will be our head of state? How do we incorporate How do we incorporate a future capital? Should it be in Dublin? Of course, as a Dublin representative born and reared in the city, I think it should be. But what about looking at a role for Belfast to play in a strengthened, devolved administration? What about the powers of our local authorities? The role and power of a county councillor in Leitrim is considerably different than someone who sits on Belfast City Council. These are big issues that I think we're starting to delve into and we're starting to tackle. We're getting more and more people wanting to discuss this conversation, but the findings and the results of opinion polls are quite stark. Ultimately, we do not have a majority in Northern Ireland at the moment who vote for unity based on opinion polls or based on electoral results, but equally in the South, we have a very large minority who aren't convinced, or when you start throwing questions about them in relation to taxation or in relation to flags or symbols or joining the Commonwealth or NATO or any of these other supranational bodies, that go very cold on the idea. So that's the whole point. We need to flesh it out. We can't simply accept, oh, well, 70% of people in the Republic want United Ireland. Sure, they're all in favour of it, but then that drops to 48% when people are asked, are they willing to increase their income tax to achieve that? How do we address that massive other in Northern Ireland? How do we convince them that we want them to be part of a new state? How do we convince unionists that by definition we don't expect them ever to vote for this because they are unionists, but how do we convince them that they will have a home in this new Ireland and that our dream won't become their nightmare? I don't want a situation when the former DUP leader Arlene Foster has to say that she'd moved to Great Britain in the case of United Ireland. I don't want anyone to have to leave the Republic or our new Republic or our new United Ireland, whatever you want to call it. And that's fundamentally what I want to work towards. In my current government role, I've asked to have as much engagement as possible to promote workers' rights on a north-south basis, to look at the development of retail strategy on a north-south basis. The amount of retailers who are obviously operating on both sides of the border are huge, to address the enterprise potential of the island as a whole where appropriate. And I long for the day in the not so distant future when I have a Northern Irish counterpart in ministerial office to do a lot more coordinated work. And when I come to Canada for a trade visit before the end of the year, I very much hope that I have a Northern Irish counterpart. Maybe they might even be in a position to join me on that trade delegation. James, I'm gonna wrap up there. I've spoken perhaps a little bit less under the 30 minutes that you allocated, but I think this is a good time to pause, take a breath, and perhaps roll into some Q&A if there are any.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Minister. That was fascinating, and there are questions coming in already. So you'll be glad to know people who've been listening, and you've obviously sparked some interest there and some questions. But you mentioned at the very start of your speech there that you thought maybe within a decade we would have a border poll. Do you really think it's that imminent? I was thinking, when I was thinking of questions to ask you, I was thinking, are we talking decades? Are we talking generations? Or are we talking even longer than that? I mean, no doubt there'll be lots of people who won't believe it'll happen in their lifetime. But so that's sort of the first side of it. And then what the vision that you have for a united Ireland, there's a school of thought that says, you know, in order to get the unionist community or those undecided over the line to be in support of such a concept, they'll be the ones who have to be, you know, given the most, if you like, if it is that simple, or that the nationalist Republicans may have to, you know, yield more ground on some of those thorny issues that you were talking about, policing, education, and then the really emotive ones that you mentioned around symbols and anthems, and whether who's going to be the head of state, or do they join the Commonwealth, or, you know, there's so many open-ended questions there.
Yeah, fundamentally, I do believe that we have the potential to be voting in a border poll within a decade. Now, I suppose what we've seen in the last couple of years has been chaotic government in the United Kingdom. And at the moments when government was most chaotic in the United Kingdom, either the latter end of Boris Johnson's prime ministership or the the very short prime ministership of Liz Truss, that looked extremely likely. You also have the situation in Scotland, where there is a consistent majority now seeking Scottish independence. I think it's really important, and in a country like Canada, this is particularly relevant when you think about the history of both Irish and Scottish migration into Canada over the last century or two. There's a huge relevance here, particularly to the people of Northern Ireland and Ulster more widely. I say that as someone who comes from a very proud Ulster Scots tradition. My mother was a Graham, relations who would have gone back across with quite a bit of regularity. And if Scotland were to, after the next election, accelerate their move towards independence, I think that would have a huge impact on this discussion. Equally, if we were to move closer to unity, I think that would have a huge impact on the situation in Scotland. And I say that just as sheer context and statement of fact, not presenting an opinion on the sovereign decision of the Scottish people. But I think absolutely we could be voting on a border poll. But I'll be quite frank, James, I don't think a border poll would pass in the next decade. The preparatory work simply hasn't been done. It hasn't been done by the British government, who would have to administer a border poll, nor has it been done of advocates for unity of every political persuasion on this island in terms of preparation of what a vision would look like and how we would actually prepare and move towards having this conversation and debate in a mature discussion. And one thing I'd like us to move towards is that when we're presenting a vision of a new Ireland, it's not about who has to give the most. It's about who can get the most in terms of creating a better state, in creating a state that has a better education system and that has a better health system, a more robust economic framework that can generate a better society.
Yeah, but Neale, you know as well as everybody else that these things are emotional as well as logical. You might say, well, an independent body might declare that the Leaving Cert is a more comprehensive education system than the A-levels, or vice versa, or that there's a better thing somewhere in between. But these are arguments that are going to be had. We saw it to a certain extent with the Good Friday Agreement in the late 90s, and the massive amount of negotiation that had to be done during that time. I mean, these are huge questions that will not be solved easily or quickly, or even to some degree at any stage.
Of course, but if we're serious about having this conversation, if we're serious about creating a new Ireland, we have to put front and centre the far more important mechanical issues. The logical steps are what will win this argument. The emotional steps will guarantee a loss of this argument. If we focus on this is the historical aspiration for reunification that was defined in the 1916 proclamation, you're never going to get buy-in, not just from the unionist community, but from the other or the newer Irish community, or a disenfranchised community in the South who go like, well, I like the idea of it, but I'm not going to pay for it. And I'm not going to pay for something that I'm not going to benefit out of, because we have to, those of us, and I say, when I keep saying we, those of us who want to drive this conversation, who want to be the political leaders of this conversation, we have to drive it onto the pitch that this is what we can achieve to create a better socio and economic environment. If we dwell solely that somehow this is a game of give or take, and it's whether the Leaving Cert is better than the A-levels and no one's discussed the International Baccalaureate, then we're guaranteed not only if we're not going to lose the referendum, but any referendum that is won won't be worth winning, because there'll be such a legacy of division and bitterness, when really, if we focus on unity, as per the statistics of Professor Joylan on DCU, could boost the household income by 5 to 10% if done right. If we focus on that argument, on how this could build better schools with lower class sizes, I think that's the only way you can win it. And also it's the only way you should seek to win it.
Yeah. Well, a question along those lines coming in from Michael McGee, who asks, what would happen to property prices if there was a United Ireland?
I don't think a border poll was going to drive property prices. We're seeing property prices in the Republic certainly slow down a bit, but they're extremely hot at the moment. I think if we look at the Northern Irish economy, when Northern Ireland does well economically, it's when there's stability. It's when there's a stable, devolved administration. When the entire island does well, it's when there's stability and there's an opportunity to thrive. Ultimately, I would think in a united Ireland, we would have the capacity to build far more homes, because we simply don't have enough homes on this island, north or south, at the moment, and we've artificially high property prices as a result. I don't think a border poll is going to drive up or drive down property prices. There's far more economic factors that would drive that.
Just another question from Daniel Shapiro Callahan, who's asking, how can the Canadian government make a positive contribution? You mentioned John de Chastelain, the Canadian general, who was a household name in Ireland for quite a while and still is to a certain extent for his work on decommissioning. I don't think he's particularly well known in Canada, but he was seen as a very honest broker from all sides, I think, in those negotiations. So there would be a track record there for Canadians. What would be a governmental role then maybe for Canada to play in all of this?
Yeah, I was very lucky to meet John de Chastelain a couple of years ago in the Oireachtas. When he came into an event, I think it was to mark the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. Without John de Chastelain, we would still have an abundance of guns and explosives on this island. He decommissioned so many tools of murder and terror that we as a nation, as a people, wherever we call home, should be forever grateful to him. Indeed, there was Canadian involvement in the Border Commission, as you remember, under Owen McNeill, all the way back, going back to the original time of the foundation of the Irish Free State and subsequent partition. But I think any government can play a huge role. I wouldn't expect another sovereign government to take a position on unity or the status quo. What I would hope for is a great role in recognising the importance of democracy in any referendum that would be held. And I look particularly at countries within the European Union, but other like-minded countries like Canada, like New Zealand, Australia. They will have a very special relationship in deepening the existing diplomatic ties that exist between Ireland in its current guise and Canada. We're very lucky to have a great embassy team in Ottawa, as well as a Canadian team here in, I think it's Ranelagh, where the embassy is, as well as our consuls in Vancouver and Toronto. Those are hugely important, and they'll need to be greatly expanded. And we'll need to see that level of engagement of with it by a Canadian government, more importantly, the Canadian people, with a new Ireland when it's achieved. And I think it'll be a very positive relationship, and it's the country that would have the most obvious close relationship with a new Ireland. Well, certainly one of the top three countries after the United Kingdom and other fellow members of the EU.
Just on the topic of a border poll then, there's a question here from Marta Horry who asks, should we extend the question of having a border poll outside of Ireland to the diaspora? I know there was some discussion and has been for a while about extending the presidential election for Ireland to the diaspora. Would this include those who are Irish but who have left?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question. That emotionally, of course, the answer is yes, but what's the practicality of it? Just in terms of the extension of the franchise for presidential elections, we're likely to have a referendum on that in May 24. And that would mean that any Irish citizen, regardless of where they live in the world, any Irish passport holder would be entitled to vote for president. And that's something I'm really supportive of, because I believe that the president is the president of the nation and of the people, not just of the state. And the difficulty then coming into the electorate for any referendum, and the system, James, as you know, in Ireland is quite complex. If you live here legally, you can vote in any local government election. To vote in a European election, you have to be a citizen of the EU. To vote in a general election, you have to be a citizen of Ireland or the United Kingdom. And to vote in a presidential election or referendum, you have to be a citizen of Ireland, and that's it. If you're an Irish citizen abroad, the only way you'll get a postal vote is if you're abroad in service of the state. Perhaps you're the diplomatic corps, the defence forces, you're travelling for work as part of government work, or you're in a nursing home, you're incapacitated. It's very hard to get a postal ballot. And it'll be very difficult to have votes abroad for those in a Dáil election for those who aren't residents in the state, because they're voting on issues that don't impact them. If you're voting for a party that will reduce income tax to 10%, but you're living in Toronto or Sydney and you're not going to be impacted by that decision, that creates a huge democratic deficit. On an issue like this, I think we have to have a serious thought about it. And I mean that in all genuineness, and I'm not trying to fob off the question. I'm a big believer that we should be extending the franchise to everyone over 16 for a start, and that's out of kilter with my party's own position. I also think if we look at the Scottish model, they really broadened out who could vote in their Scottish independence referendum. It wasn't just citizens, and I think that goes for the start, that we need to allow a referendum on this issue be open to everyone living in Ireland, on the island of Ireland, who's there legally, who's there permanently. I think the notion by our current law that if we weren't allowed British citizens who live in Dublin or Cork to vote in this, I think it defeats the entire purpose of creating a new Ireland. The role of the diaspora, I'm up for that discussion. My impression is that for those who've been out of the state longer than 18 months, as per current electoral law, I would be concerned that far too many people are voting for an aspiration that doesn't impact them materially on a day-to-day scale, and that's just a concern I'd have. But again, it's a discussion that I haven't cast my opinion absolutely on, but I will be quite far along in terms of broadening the franchise, both in terms of age and eligibility that we have here anyway.
Okay, thank you. Michelle Sullivan asks, what do you feel are the most common objections to unification? I mean, you talk to your colleagues in the north, you talk to colleagues in the UK and elsewhere who may be terrified of this prospect. What are their main arguments for that?
Yeah, well, I think fundamentally the first objection is there's over 1 million people in this island who are British, and they see themselves as British, and they want to be part of the United Kingdom. They don't want to be part. Many of these unionists would love to see United Ireland within the United Kingdom. And, you know, when that statement is said, it's dismissed and we laugh at it or we bristle at it. But, you know, that's a validly held opinion, not one I agree with, but I think we have to respect that. Then there is a fear within unionism and loyalism that they'll be overwhelmed and that they'll be forced to do things that they don't want to do. And more practically, when we talk about the objections, you know, there is a lot of disinformation that goes along with this. And I hear it a lot from loyalist and unionist commentators who say, well, the pension rates are so much lower in the south. They're not. They're considerably higher for a start. They'll talk about the mad housing crisis or the issues in the healthcare system. When you actually put the two side by side, they're actually quite comparable in terms of Northern Ireland Republic. Then on the south, there is a genuine concern that this will lead to a serious change in terms of taxation, that this will be an extremely costly venture. And that's a valid concern, and we have to lay out how that can be mitigated through a genuine economic program. There's others say, well, what are we bringing on ourselves in terms of political instability? And that's a fair concern, particularly at the moment when we have a Northern Ireland that simply isn't working because of intransigence of certain people collapsing the institutions and not buying into the system. And that's why the short-term work is so important. Whether we aspire to unity or the status quo, we need to do more of that work in relation to building a shared island, in terms of getting the North-South bodies back up and working, in terms of moving out of the political sphere to move the societal engagement North-South far closer, be it in terms of higher education, the economy, sport and social moves as well.
So a couple of questions coming in that are more around how we convince those, how we allay those fears of that unionists might have of entering into this new United Ireland that you're speaking about. What ways we can address that, even, you know, obviously you're on the political level, but then even there's a question from Joanne Rolston who's asking about even family members who may be very worried about this prospect, and how would you go about talking to them and allaying those fears that they may have?
Well, I think when it comes down to those who are unionists and are British and aren't going to vote for unity, we still have to allay concerns, and we have to make it quite clear that a new Ireland there will be genuine parity and esteem between those who are British and those who are Irish, that there will be no requirement for anyone in a new Ireland to seek an Irish passport if they have a British passport. That goes down quite fundamentally. On a more practical scale, and a lot of people, and this is something that came up post-Brexit, a lot of people were concerned about their pension entitlements. Well, the pension entitlements will be maintained. And we saw that in Brexit, the amount of Irish people who would have an element of a British pension who worked in the UK for certain years, of course, they received that pension having paid into it. But you can't delay concerns unless you dig into what the concerns are. And that requires engagement, and that requires really hard work. That requires going up and having the conversations in Tigers Bay or in the Waterside or wherever it is across Northern Ireland with people who you disagree with, and perhaps who don't want to have that conversation. It's that constant approach. And I'm very lucky. I speak to unionist politicians every day. I'm on a texting relationship with Jeffrey Donaldson and Doug Beattie and many other figures within the unionist political community, as well as those in civic society. And digging into the fears is a difficult job, but that's why you have to lay out a vision that is realistic, that's obtainable, and that is appealing, that it isn't front loaded about flags and symbols and emblems and forcing things on people who don't necessarily want it. It's about looking at the positives of creating a new venture and stressing that this has to be about a new Ireland.
Well, on a more practical level, there's a question from Dave Kiffin, who asks, what kind of structural or constitutional changes would you envision occurring in the territory that would be a new Ireland? I mean, would you see a sort of a federalism or a provincial style like we have here in Canada, or something else?
For me, I wouldn't. And this is a debate. This is an area where I actually disagree with my own party leader and a couple of other people who've spoken about this. For me, unity is about consolidation. We're a small entity on the periphery of Europe, and the whole prize here is bringing things to work more closely, bringing things together to work more closely and more efficiently. So I think there shouldn't be a federalized jurisdiction in a country of 7 million people. Absolutely, there's a role to strengthen local government in terms of city and county councils. But I think if you had a singular, so I would have a singular elected head of state for a 5-year term, with the sort of ceremonial powers that our current president has. I would have, personally, I think I'm on the fence. I kind of change my opinion on this on a daily basis, but I think we have a single parliament elected by PRS-TV from across the island. There absolutely is scope to have a second chamber, a senate, or whatever you want to call it, with a different electoral or appointment system to ensure checks and balances. I'm not convinced by that. I'm edging towards a unicameral system, having served in both houses of our parliament. But I think a lot of this for me, James, is about the transition and the importance in the initial decade or 15 years of ensuring you don't allow people to identify, such as they do in Northern Ireland, as unionist, nationalist or other, but rather that you have the agreement that you will have a Speaker of Parliament and a Deputy Speaker, and that one of those positions must be held by someone from what was the jurisdiction in Northern Ireland. And that should then be rolled out to every parliamentary committee. And indeed that the Cabinet should have 1/3 representation from all people from the jurisdiction that was known as Northern Ireland. I think that's one way that you also break down the historic barriers to create a better functioning form of democracy. This is heavily reliant on a strong, as I said, on a strong local government, stronger than what we have in either jurisdiction at the moment, with real powers for local mayors based on the county system, indeed a regional system, be it in provinces or the regional assembly structure as per the European Union. And that would be my personal vision. That's up for discussion. I think an extension of what we have in terms of the status quo in the Republic, I don't think that would be agreeable. I think we would risk moving down the difficulty that other states like the Lebanon or Northern Ireland at the moment are constantly running into. I think a far better new Ireland would have a new constitution, a fully new constitution, taking the best bits of Bunreacht na hÉireann, but adding to it. Because Bunreacht na hÉireann was drawn up originally a long time ago, and it's been amended over 30 times for good reason. But we can take the best bits of it, and we can look at other new states or other states that face the sort of difficulties in terms of demographic representation that a new Ireland would, and accept and apply the best elements of those states.
Yeah, there's a question from Chris Durant from Kingston, Ontario. He's wanting to know about the role of the monarchy and how the monarchy could influence or be a part of the solution, if you like, for this question. Would they support a unification of Ireland? Would they even express a view on that? I don't. Has any thought been given about a strategy in that area?
I fundamentally wouldn't expect the monarchy to support the idea of reunification. I wouldn't expect the monarchy to support the notion of the United Kingdom becoming smaller. And I think that's a fair constitutional position for them to take. Like the term loyalist is you're loyal to the crown. If you're a unionist, you believe in the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But in terms of, and this is where the monarchy has played a very big role already, in terms of accepting any democratic decision and ensuring the continuation and more societal acceptance, the monarchy has played a very important role. And we look at what the late Queen Elizabeth II did in terms of the Good Friday Agreement. We look at the effort that she went to and her family members have gone to in terms of boosting and fostering reconciliation. We look at, prior to the Good Friday Agreement, the visit of the now King to the Glencree Reconciliation Centre. I have no doubt that if we get an agreement on the Westminster framework, that we will see a royal visit to Northern Ireland, just like we'll probably see the visit of Joe Biden. I think that's a huge role of the monarchy. But one question we have to consider is what role we allow the monarchy to have in in terms of the running of a new Ireland. Like, obviously, it would, in my opinion, would have to be a republic, but we have to develop a bilateral relationship between Ireland and what's left of the United Kingdom that is stronger than Ireland has with any other country. Geography and history dictates that, James, as well as economic security and social interests. This isn't just about maintaining a link that those who are in the former unionist community can cling to, but also it simply makes common sense. We need a new Ireland, much like the current Ireland. We need a fully functioning United Kingdom, and we need good relations. Ironically, Brexit has seen Ireland lose its closest ally in the European Union. We relied, as much as joining the EEC gave Ireland the greatest sense of independence since the creation of the Irish Free State, it also drew us so much more closer to the United Kingdom because we had shared strategic interests, and we certainly are suffering. But I think the monarchy is a huge role to play in this, but we can't underestimate that it is obviously their accepted position that they want the union to stand.
Yeah. The question from Ed McCann. He's asking about the timing of the border poll as well, but he's asking also, is there a fear or risk that this all could backfire, and to go down this road and end up back in a world of violence again, where a large section of the community or a significant section of the community simply do not agree with this and will not stand for it?
There's genuine risk, and I say that very solemnly and sincerely, but there is ways to mitigate the risk. Constantly calling for a border poll and demanding a border poll, I don't think is wise at the moment. And I think pushing to name a date to set a date isn't wise either. And that's what leads to the level of instability and concern and the fear of besiegement within the unionist community. But equally, I think it can't be stressed enough that whilst we certainly see elements of dissident paramilitarism in Northern Ireland, it is extremely small. And the individuals that cause such misery from both sides of the community throughout the Troubles, a lot of them, not only are they older and slower, for want of a better word, and they have moved to a post-violence parallel because they know that it doesn't work. You don't achieve your aims through violence. It's through discourse, it's through discussion, it's through democratic engagement. But that's why this whole topic, it's not one to beat the chest about. It's one to genuinely seek engagement. And I was very struck, the SDLP in Northern Ireland, the Social Democrat and Labour Party, the party of Hugh Mallon, launched their New Ireland Commission today. And they launched it they'd launched the commission before, but they launched the 6 guiding policies. And the first one, I think, is the most important policy principle, and I agree with it. The first principle of this process should be reconciliation. Achieving a new Ireland shouldn't be about reigniting old tensions or creating divisions or giving reason to those who seek to cause dismay. It should be focusing on reconciliation, because I said at the outset, James, I fundamentally believe that far more unites us than divides us across this island, and that should be the focus. And if we approach this in a genuinely generous and ambitious way, I think we can achieve that.
Just a couple more questions, because we're coming to the end now, but we are an organisation of business and trade, and both the Chamber and the Business Council. And there's a question from Carol McCormick, who first wants to thank you for your enlightening information. But she wants to know, do you think that there's an advantage at this time for a Canadian company establishing their business in Ireland? And equally, Carol isn't asking this, but I would. What about Irish companies who might like to look to set up a North American base in Canada, in Montreal, hopefully, or in other business centres around the country?
The transatlantic relationship between Ireland and Canada is grossly under optimized in terms of economic opportunities. I think CETA, and okay, there's an element of that in terms of ratification that's stuck in the Irish Supreme Court at the moment, but CETA provides us a gateway to unleash so much opportunity. This is a great time to establish a business in Ireland. It's a particularly good time, and this probably would go against the aims of my own government department, but it's a particularly good time to also look at Northern Ireland for a base in terms of accessing both markets. But for any company,
we saw a Montreal-based IT company, CGI, just create 50 jobs in Belfast. So it is happening.
Yeah, and we see the big four accountancy firms have all massively expanded their operations in Belfast for a good reason. We've seen a number of companies, Amazon, Marks and Spencer's, really deepen their level of engagement in Northern Ireland. But certainly for a North American company, particularly a Canadian company wanting to access the European single market, there is no better place, there's no better jurisdiction than Ireland to invest in, to establish in. You know, it's a common law jurisdiction with a highly educated workforce, English as a first language, with full access to the European single market, a very pro-business atmosphere in terms of regulation, and we fundamentally believe in open and freer trading. That's something that you don't necessarily get in any other EU member state. Now is a great time to invest in Ireland, to open up in Ireland, but equally for an Irish company looking at the Canadian market, be it Montreal, James, or into Ontario, or indeed any of the Canadian provinces and territories, there's huge potential there to export goods and services that is grossly under-realised. And there's a reason we're having a trade mission. There's a reason why we're sending 2, if not 3 government ministers on St. Patrick's Day trade missions to Canada, including our Minister for Finance. It's because the potential for engagement and exchange between Ireland and Canada has never been greater. It's really quite exciting. If you look at how rapidly there's elements of growth in the Irish economy and how that can marry up with Canada, I think Canada is the obvious gateway into Europe or Ireland is the obvious gateway into Europe for any Canadian company, but equally the Canadian market for any Irish exporters offers huge potential. And even in the early stages of CETA, we've seen so much development in terms of Irish exports to Canada, life sciences, pharmaceuticals, as well as the traditional agri-food products that go from Ireland around the world, be it butter or steak or baby formula, which we're very proud of our exports thereof.
Yeah, you've obviously been working on your speaking notes ahead of those trade missions, so well done for that. You've learned them off. I think we'll have to leave there. Just before you go, Ireland have 2 games left in the Six Nations this year, and in a World Cup year. They're going well so far. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I was very disappointed to see the Ireland women's sevens team lose to Canada in Vancouver overnight. But apart from that, this is a really good Irish rugby team, and we are in a golden era. I've been lucky to get to most of the matches so far in the Six Nations. I'm traveling to Edinburgh on Friday. I have great hopes and expectations for a Grand Slam, and I really am looking forward to the World Cup and seeing Ireland do extremely well. If they have the ability to win it, James, you've been watching rugby as long as I have, if not longer. This is a really good Irish team. I think they
always find a way to peak between World Cups, and then they end up there and it doesn't go their way. But
I would have thought that, but the way they played against New Zealand in the summer and then completely played a different game against South Africa in November, and I think with Johnny Sexton, we are witnessing perhaps Ireland's greatest ever rugby player.
Well, we'll in the immortal words of the late Bill O'Hurley, we'll leave it there. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you giving up your time. I know you're a busy man, as all ministers are. So thank you so much. I can say on behalf of lots of messages coming in, people saying thanking you for your time, and this was a really interesting session, and we hope to have you back sometime in the future.
Thanks very much. Talk to you soon, hopefully in Canada.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.